These are the lectures for Chapter 6 on bones and skeletal tissues. There's a little bit of information on cartilage. Cartilage contains no blood vessels or nerves. I'm just trying to see what I want you to have from this. Well, so just in general, if we are comparing cartilage tissue to bone tissue, cartilage has no blood vessels or nerves. So cartilage, if you damage cartilage, it doesn't have a good ability to repair itself or regenerate. The layer of connective tissue that surrounds cartilage is called the perichondrium, and it's dense connective tissue, just like, tendons and ligaments are. Cartilage has chondrocytes instead of osteocytes. So chondrocytes are cartilage cells, and they reside in a cavity called a lacuna, and they're surrounded with a jelly-like extracellular matrix. So the matrix of cartilage is not quite as tough as the matrix of bone. But there are 3 types of cartilage, which we went over this in Chapter 4, but just very briefly I will. Hyaline, we're going to find at the ends of long bones at areas we call joints or articulations. So you find hyaline cartilage lining bones at joints. The costal cartilages, which is the cartilage that connects the ribs to the sternum and to each other, those are hyaline cartilage. The cartilages that form the rings in the trachea, so the respiratory passageways, the larynx, which is the voice box, the trachea, which is the windpipe, the epiglottis is hyaline cartilage. No, it's not. It's elastic. I'm so sorry. Elastic cartilage is a lot more flexible, and we find it forming the external ear, and also the epiglottis, which is the flap of tissue that closes over your airways so food won't go down the wrong way. And then fibrocartilage is the toughest. And so the meniscus or menisci of the knee, that's not public, it's supposed to be pubic, but the pubic symphysis and then the intervertebral disc between the vertebrae of your spine, those are fibrocartilage. All right, so growth of cartilage, I'm going to skip, and we're going to move on and just do bones because this chapter is long enough. So we really have to focus on the areas that are important. Bones function in support and protection for sure, and as anchors for skeletal muscles. But some of the functions that you may not know, you probably know that bones store calcium and phosphorus. But bones also store fat in the yellow bone marrow. So triglyceride or fat storage, that happens in the yellow bone marrow, which is in the diaphysis of your long bones or the shaft of your long bones. Bones also produce all of the blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, even platelets, which are fragments of blood cells. All this happens in red bone marrow, and that is called hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is the formation of blood cells, and it occurs in the red bone marrow. And red bone marrow is found in spongy bone tissue instead of being found in the shaft of bones. And there is a hormone that bones produce. The hormone called osteocalcin. We don't talk about it much, and we won't talk about it much in this chapter, but the bones do technically produce a hormone. There are 206 bones in the human skeleton that have names, and the skeleton is divided into the axial skeleton, which consists of the skull, the vertebral column or spine, and the rib cage. and then the appendicular skeleton, which is the upper limbs, lower limbs, and then the pelvic and pectoral girdle. All right, so what you're looking at here is this is showing you the axial skeleton, which is more in orange, the skull, the spine or vertebrae, and the ribs. And then all the rest, which would be the pectoral girdle, is like the collarbone and the shoulder blade. So the clavicle and the scapula together form the pectoral girdle. And the pelvic girdle is formed by the bones of the hip, the coxal bones. Anyway, that's the pelvic girdle, and also by the, that's good enough. By the hip bones, basically. Pelvic girdle is the pelvis, and the pectoral girdle is the clavicle and the scapula. And then the upper arms, all of those form the appendicular skeleton. So bones are classified according to one of four shapes. Long bones are mostly going to be limb bones and finger bones, bones of the upper and lower limbs. Short bones are going to be the tarsals and the carpals. They are cube-shaped bones. So the wrist and the ankle bones. The wrist bones are the carpals and the ankle bones are the tarsals. Then within short bones, you can have sesamoid bones like the kneecap or patella. They actually form within a tendon. And this tendon is the patellar tendon, which becomes the, I can't think of what, the patellar tendon, which is the quadriceps tendon. It all kind of fuses into one tendon. But the patella or the kneecap forms within that tendon. Then there are flat bones like the sternum or breastbone, the ribs, and then most of your skull bones, the bones of your cranium, not your facial bones, but your cranial bones are flat. Then we have irregular bones that have an irregular shape. So the bones that form your spine, the vertebrae, and also the hip bones tend to be irregular. They are irregular bones. Got some pictures here. Now we're going to talk about bone structure. Bone tissue is called osseous tissue, and it is vascular. There are two types of bone tissue. There's compact bone, which is a dense bone tissue, and then spongy bone, which is a bone tissue that has that's composed of these plates called trabeculae, but they have like these spaces in between them. So spongy bone just looks spongy. It has these open spaces between trabeculae. And that is where you find typically the red bone marrow. Compact bone is found, it's very dense, and it's the outer layer of all bone tissue, but you find mostly compact bone within the diaphysis of long bones. So what we're looking at here is one end of the femur. Okay, and you can see the spongy bone tissue in the epiphysis of the femur bone, right? So this is all spongy bone. It's made of trabeculae, and inside of those open spaces is red bone marrow primarily. Then you have compact bone primarily forming the diaphysis or the shaft. Now, the inside lining, there's always a very, very thin inside lining that's directly exposed to the shaft of the bone, like in the very inside, lining that medullary cavity or shaft is spongy bone, but most of it is compact bone. So compact bone is covered by periosteum, and then the inside portion of compact bone is covered by endosteum. There is a marrow cavity in compact bone that's formed within the diaphysis or the shaft, and bone that connects with another bone at a joint is covered by hyaline cartilage or articular cartilage. All right, we are gonna go into the structure of a typical long bone in a little more detail. So the shaft of long bone is called the diaphysis, and the ends are called the epiphyses. So the diaphysis is primarily compact bone, and it does have a medullary cavity, which we call bone marrow. It's filled with yellow bone marrow in adults. And then the red bone marrow is found in the spongy bone tissue within those epiphyses, which are the ends of the long bones. They are covered with a layer of compact bone, but mostly they are filled with spongy bone, the epiphyses. And the epiphyses are also covered with articular cartilage, which is hyaline cartilage, covers the joint surfaces or articular surfaces. If the bone has completely grown, if it's a fully mature adult bone, then there will be an epiphyseal line forming between the diaphysis and the epiphyses. You'll have two lines, at each epiphysis. And then if the person is still growing, if that bone is still growing, that line is called an epiphyseal plate, because it's composed of hyaline cartilage, and it's continually allowing for the growth in length and width of that bone. So your basically at the end of the bone, you have your articular cartilage, which protects the ends of the bone at the joint, and that articular cartilage is composed of hyaline cartilage. You have the epiphyses, which are the ends of your long bone, and then you have the diaphysis, which is the shaft. The spongy bone is found more in the epiphyses, and then compact is found more in the shaft or the diaphysis. The cavity within the diaphysis is called the medullary cavity, and it's the inside of it is filled with yellow bone marrow, and you can see the epiphyseal line, which forms where the epiphyseal plate once was. When the line is filled in, that means the bone has stopped growing. But if it's filled with cartilage still, hyaline cartilage, then it's an epiphyseal plate and the bone is still growing. Now, long bones are covered on the outside by periosteum. The periosteum has an outer fibrous layer consisting of, they're called Sharpie's fibers because there are lots and lots of protein fibers in there that form that layer. And then there's the osteogenic layer inside that contains cells, stem cells, that can produce more bone cells. And it's the anchoring point for tendons and ligaments. The periosteum. The periosteum is the anchoring point for tendons and ligaments. And actually, that outside fibrous layer of the periosteum kind of is continuous with or fuses in with any tendon that connects it to a muscle or any ligament that connects it to another bone. So the endosteum, which lines, covers the trabeculae of spongy bone, and it lines the inside bone surfaces, and it does contain osteogenic cells. So it's just the inner lining of bone surfaces, endosteum. Periosteum is outside lining. So periosteum is going to be found lining the outside of this bone, and then endosteum is going to be found on the inside. So where the medullary cavity is. Red bone marrow is found within spongy bone tissue. And that's where blood cells are produced. And then yellow bone marrow is found in the diaphysis of long bones in adults. Bone markings can be sites for muscle, ligament, and tendon attachment. And then you can have bone depressions, which are areas where blood vessels and nerves will run. So if the bone marking is called, for example, a tuberosity, that's going to be a large rounded projection, and it may be like a rough projection. That's a tuberosity. Let's see if we see any. The ischial tuberosity is the place where, the ischium is our sitting. It's where we sit. Our hip bone is composed of an ilium, an ischium, and a pubic bone. And the ischium is our sitting bones, basically. So the ischial tuberosity here, you can see it's rough and it's large. It's just a projection off of the bone that we call the ischium. Okay. Sometimes you can have a crest like this. This is a narrow ridge. The iliac crest is this rounded crest that forms that wide top part of your hip bones. You can have a spine, which is a sharp, slender, pointed projection. Here's an ischial spine. The spinous process of your vertebrae that forms the bumps or the ridges that you can feel through your skin, where you can see those ridges that form your backbone. And a tubercle is a small rounded projection. A trochanter is a very large, blunt, irregularly shaped process. The only bone that has trochanters is the femur, and it has the greater trochanter and then the lesser trochanter here. Condyles are or epicondyle, a raised area on or above a condyle. So you have the medial epicondyle, and then a condyle is, I guess, going to be listed in the surfaces that form joints. So depressions can be a foramen, which is a basically round or oval hole through a bone, and that's going to be a passageway for blood vessels usually. You can have a meatus, which is a canal-like passageway, a sinus, which is a cavity within a bone, usually lined with mucous membranes. So we find this in our skull. It shows you this is the frontal sinus in the frontal bone, but there are sinuses in other facial bones. All right. There is 5 major bone cell types. Okay. So there are osteoprogenitor or osteogenic cells, which are bone stem cells. They can form into osteoblast. And then osteoblast, once they secrete bone tissue and they're completely surrounded by bone matrix, they will mature and become osteocytes. And then the osteocytes will just continue to carry out their regular processes. But osteocytes are mature bone cells, but they began as osteoblasts. Then we have cells, they're called bone lining cells, and then we have osteoclast. And I know for sure that the osteoclast do not originate as osteogenic cells. So the osteoprogenitor or osteogenic cells are active stem cells that can produce new bone cells. And they become either, all right, so osteogenic or osteoprogenitor can either differentiate into osteoblast, and then osteoblast eventually will form into osteocytes, or they can differentiate into bone lining cells. So that's an osteoprogenitor cell. Some become osteoblast, and osteoblasts secrete bone matrix. They are bone-forming cells that secrete bone matrix. And bone matrix called an osteoid is made up of collagen fibers and then calcium-binding proteins, typically that is called hydroxyapatite. That's the hard mineralized part of bone. So you have calcium that is surrounded with these calcium-binding proteins. Collagen makes up 90% of bone protein. So the osteoblasts are formed from osteogenic cells, and they secrete bone matrix. They become osteocytes, which are mature bone cells that reside in a cavity called a lacuna. They no longer divide, and they maintain bone matrix. And then osteoclasts, so here's an osteocyte. Osteoclasts are derived from hematopoietic stem cells. In other words, cells that form the same stem cells that become macrophages are the ones that produce osteoclasts. So they're not actually bone stem cells, they're blood stem cells. But osteoclasts, what they are, they're giant cells. They have many nuclei, they're multinucleate cells. And they function in bone resorption or bone breakdown. So osteoblasts produce new bone tissue, and osteoclasts break down bone tissue. And that's what an osteoclast looks like. Now, bone lining cells, which they're just calling bone lining cells, I guess they have different names depending on where they are. They're the flat cells on bone surfaces, and those are also formed from the osteogenic stem cells. All right, compact bone, also called lamellar bone, consists of, and we'll call it just compact bone, consists of osteons, units of bone tissue called osteons, and then also canals and canaliculi that take nutrients and oxygen to living bone tissue. And then in between the osteons, you have bone tissue that fills in the spaces, and that's called interstitial and circumferential. So I'll just have to show you that. So the osteon is a structural unit of compact bone. And let me show you what it looks like. So if we look at bone tissue under the microscope, what we're going to see is the circular, and this is like a cross section through it. The osteon looks like a straw, but it's just that the sides of the straw are thick instead of a straw with a big hole in the center and a very thin plastic, straw. It would be like a really thick, hard straw with a small hole in the center. But an osteon is like a cylinder, okay? So you see all of these form these long cylinders through the length of long bone, okay? So, but in between the osteon, there's areas that you have to fill in with bone tissue, and that is called interstitial bone. I'm trying to find it. Interstitial lamella. Lamella are bone layers in bone. So every one of these layers of bone tissue is lamella. All right. So there is the lamella that forms the osteon. That is, then there is, which is just concentric circles. So the lamella, or the bone layers that form the osteon. Then there's in between those osteons are spaces that have to be filled. That's interstitial lamella. Then outside, completely on the outside, are these layers of bone called, these large round layers called circumferential lamella. You also have the cells called osteocytes that reside within their lacuna, and you have these little canals called canaliculi that transport nutrients from the central canal to the individual bone cells. So with our notes, we will say an osteon is a structural unit of compact bone. Sorry. And it contains rings of bone matrix called lamellae. Lamellae are just layers of bone tissue. Then you have, in the center of your osteon is a canal called a central canal or haversian canal, and it contains blood vessels and nerve fibers, and it runs through the center of the osteon. That would be kind of like the hole in the straw that you drink through, okay? So it's a hole that runs through the entire osteon. Then we have these canals called perforating or Volkmann's canals that run perpendicular to the central canal. They run through the sides of the osteon. And they're just more connections that enable materials to be transported, through the bone tissue. Then there are lacunae, and those are the cavities that contain the osteocytes. It's a little cavity that each osteocyte resides in, and little tiny canals that connect the central canal to the individual osteocytes. Those are called canaliculi. And in addition to osteons, compact bone is composed of interstitial lamella, which is layers of bone tissue that fill the gaps between osteons. And then there's circumferential lamella, which are these layers of lamella that are outside of all of the osteons and interstitial lamella. They're on the most outside portion of your compact bone tissue, and they're right underneath or deep to the periosteum. And so that's how it's all set up and arranged. And spongy bone is composed of trabeculae, which we've already talked about. All right, so we'll stop here because I'm already at 26 minutes. I'm sorry. I try to keep it 20 minutes or less for each recording. But anyway, we're going to stop, and at 45 is where we're stopping, and we'll start back at slide number 26.